Hello everyone, Merry Meet, this is Darius. I know, my upload schedule is extremely erratic. My computer's broken right now, so this is why phone. Which explains the odd angle and the fact that it's going to be moving pretty much constantly throughout the video. If that bothers you, watch something else or take a Dramamine, honey. I can't do anything about it right now. I'm just putting out a relatively quick video, so this one wasn't really planned, not that most of my videos are. I felt remiss, even with a broken computer, to let this season pass without talking about Samhain, without talking about the traditions of the Day of the Dead, and kind of why we celebrate this at this time. There's a fair number of detractors from what I've seen. From what I understand, a fair number of detractors who say, oh, well, the Wheel of Wick and Wheel of Year is so subjective, and a lot of these holidays were from different cultures, or from different times, or some are just fabrications, modern fabrications, based on rumor of historians, and I'm like, okay, well, some of that might be true. But each of these still does signify a piece of the lore of the turning cycles of the year in agrarian society in Europe, and that much of that still applies to us today. Now, I'm going to put on my old fogey hat and tell you why you should at least acknowledge the Wheel of the Year if you don't acknowledge the Sabbats themselves, the cycles of the year. And I'm going to do that by going, okay, well, why is Samhain in October? Why is Samhain at the end of October? And one could talk about historically why, All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, but those were adaptations on older European celebrations of Samhain. So why was Samhain at this time at its earliest iterations? Because at its earliest iterations, it was still a late autumn, early winter holiday. A late autumn, early winter holiday. It was still a holiday. Get my finger, sorry, like finger in your face. It was still a late autumn, early winter holiday, and it was very much when the frost comes in, when the leaves are turning, when the darkness falls. And there's symbolism in that. There's symbolism in the slowly dying of the Wheel of the Year, heading toward the late winter, early spring rebirth, in that observable symbolism. But if you look at it energetically, if you look at it from an energy perspective, there's also something innate to that cycle, where not only is it the life cycles of nature for things to hibernate, for things to go under, for things to migrate, to avoid death by cold, or to have a feeding frenzy and preserve themselves so they have fat stores over the winter so they don't suffer death by cold, freezing to death. But in ancient times, humans, Samhain was the slaughter. Samhain was the time to slaughter as many cattle as you thought you couldn't support, and to keep alive only the ones you could. This is one of the reasons divination was so important at Samhain, is because you had to divine to see how much food you would need. How long will the winter be? How harsh will the winter be? How many cows do I need to keep alive to breed in spring, while still killing as many cows as I can to preserve the food for the cows I need to keep alive? This is why Samhain was a giant meat feast in the older traditions. This is why Samhain was not the vegetarian's friend as far as a meal goes, because it was meat dishes, because it was the slaughter of the cattle. Lunasa and Mabon, the first and second fall Sabbats, August and September, respectively, those were mostly August was grain, September was mostly vegetable. Samhain is the harvest of the meat and the harvest of the blood, because things are slaughtered now, because you can't afford to feed them over the winter. That was the agrarian angle for one of the reasons this was so close to death. And the other was to make peace. Make peace because you were making peace with your ancestors now, because you may meet them in the coming winter if you froze to death, or if you were wrong about the number of cattle you slaughtered, or if you ran out of food, or if something else untoward happened, like, say, hungry wolves. This is one of the reasons that some symbolize the waxing side of the wheel of the year with a stag and the waning side of the wheel of the year with a wolf, a hungry wolf. Because autumn into winter is a more harsh, shadowed, almost predatory feeling time. So, anyway, that's one point of the logic. Another, very simply, is if you look at the way that people say the veil is thinnest at Samhain between the land of the living and the land of the dead. There's a reason for that, and it's not just an association and a psychosomatic reaction. The veil is thinnest because the vast majority of things at this side of the wheel of the year die. At this side of the yearly cycle, die. And that influx of life force into the potential life force of the death side of the death and rebirth cycle, that exodus of life force as plants die and trees die and animals die or migrate or are hunted by other animals or by humans, as the cattle slaughter happened every year, as all of this continued over and over and over again. There were many reasons, that being probably one of the biggest, why the veil between the living and the dead is so thin at Samhain. There is this great exodus of life force. That exodus has to travel through. That thins the veil. Among other things, it might just partly also be the rotation of the Earth and the Earth's physical position in relation to astral and ethereal planes at that time. I'm not entirely certain. Because clearly, the veil is thinnest here in the northern hemisphere for us, which would be the reverse on the southern hemisphere, which means the thinning of the veil can be a relatively local phenomenon and not necessarily a worldwide one. It could be thinning for the northern hemisphere because a vast exodus of life in our fall and their spring, in their fall and our spring. For them, it's a vast exodus of life. So that's a thing. Let's talk about Beltane. Let's talk about Walpurgisnacht. Let's talk about May Day, because that is the opposite point of the Wheel of the Year. And at Beltane is when vegetation burgeons, when vegetation overwhelms the natural cycles, when we see animals mating and things being birthed and new life coming in, and that is the entrance, that is the influx of life to the physical plane. After winter into spring, the influx of life from the physical plane. Well, Beltane is, among many, known Beltane, like Ostara to Beltane in Midsummer, believe it or not, is this long influx of life force and is associated with nature spirits and the Fae. Fun fact. For those of you who don't practice Beltane in Beltane, Ostara, or Midsummer, not in that order, with associations with the Fae or with nature spirits or with elementals, that is the time of waxing life force, and so the veil between the generative forces in nature and the elemental forces in nature is thinnest because that's the influx into the physical realm. Which makes this an interesting juxtaposition where, when the northern hemisphere is having its influx of life, the southern hemisphere is having its influx of death, and the outflow of life, and the influx of stagnant and restful energies of death and cold and darkness. And when the southern hemisphere is having their influx of life, the northern hemisphere is having the outflow of life and the influx of death. Interesting. I think so. I think it is. So the Sabbats are placed that way. You don't have to celebrate the Sabbats. People celebrate the season. Witches celebrate the seasons without the Sabbats all the time, particularly if they're not Wiccan. A fair number of traditional witches decided to kind of do away with, or either do away with their practice of the Sabbats and just celebrate the seasons, or celebrate the Sabbats on seasonal signals instead of fixed dates, like a lot of traditional Wiccans do. Hell, even some traditional Wiccans decided to not do it on, not celebrate the Sabbats on fixed dates, but celebrate them on natural occurrences. Like some celebrate Ostara when they first see Crocus and Snowdrop come up. Crocus and Snowdrop, early spring bloomers. Some celebrate Beltane when it hits a certain temperature, or when the days reach a certain length, which is, actually far more fixed, so you might as well have a date at that point. But like some people will celebrate, a lot of people will celebrate Ostara with, the vernal equinox as an astrological phenomenon, as a yearly phenomenon. That's fine. I do that. But some will celebrate with signs or signals or other things. This is also good. Both are in their own way attempting to align themselves with natural currents that have always been there, and with currents that most, if not all, of our seasonal celebrations are based around. So, if someone's celebrating Samhain, there's a relevance to it, to the natural cycle of the year, not just as a tradition of Wicca or a tradition of modern witchcraft, but as a throwback to the traditions of this is the time of death. This is the time of waning life force. This is the time where we acknowledge our ancestry, because winter is the most dangerous season, and we need to meet it. Granted, one may argue with the onset of climate change and the excess of hurricanes lately, and a few other factors, that maybe that's not necessarily entirely objectively true anymore. But historically, even in modern days, winter with ice and freezing rain is when most car crashes happen. Winter is when heating bills go up and bills get tighter. Winter is generally when one cannot get fresh food as easily, or at least not in a traditional agrarian society. You can get vegetables from the market, but they're not exactly fresh. They have to be trucked in freezer trucks from countries away, because it doesn't grow around here in winter. So that's a thing. I think a lot of people vastly kind of overbrush a lot of these bits when they try to celebrate Sabbats. They don't think, well, why is this Sabbat at this time of year? What does it signify? And what does that actually mean in the natural cycles? One can say what it means to the cycle of the goddess and god in Wicca, or to the cycles of gods in certain mythologies that one may celebrate. But what does it mean with nature? What does it mean with the natural cycles? What does it mean with the influx and outflow of different energies in nature yearly? How does that happen every year? What happens at that point every year, or near that point every year, that we celebrate this Sabbat or that Sabbat, or acknowledge this part of the year or that part of the year? Why? And this, aside from the traditional meditations of Samhain with the ancestors and meeting with the ancestors and acknowledging the dead, and that's awesome. This is also a thing we can look into and celebrate, and, well, maybe more solemnly acknowledge than celebrate. We can celebrate it, I guess. I would more solemnly acknowledge it, just because it's a constant, and it's something that... Do I celebrate my house, or do I respect it? Do I try to keep it clean and fail? This is an old house. I'm kind of, in some ways, given up on cleaning it. I'm hoping to move in the next year or two, because, oh my lord. Anyway, wish me luck on that front. Samhain. Yeah. If you are celebrating Samhain I think if you're celebrating Samhain and you're just doing it with the ancestors, that's cool. It's traditional. I think if you don't delve into the deeper significance of this time of year, and why the veil is this thin at this time of year, and why ancestor communication is so easy, and why it comes to us as a species so easily, feeling the winter coming and instinctively reaching out to make peace. Maybe there's something on our parts that is also doing this. I think if we don't think about that, we do ourselves a bit of a disservice. Not a huge disservice, but a bit of a disservice. And so I encourage, as I always do in the darker half of the year, I encourage reflection. I encourage you to look inward and reflect on what's happening, what has happened, and what you hope will happen. Look to it, understand it, and work with it. This is how you celebrate the Wheel of the Year constructively. Not just traditionally, which is good, but constructively, moving forward. Just my thoughts. Just my thoughts. May I part? And blessed be.